has some, well, before it even became a bed and breakfast, she was renting it as a house share, which is how I first got in there. But then she turned it into a bed and breakfast. And I had the room on the second floor that was at the back of the house. And there was on that side of the house a bathroom and then another room. And one night, I was up all night because I kept hearing banging of furniture and the bed, a bed sliding, it sounded like. And so the next day when I got up and Cheryl came over, I said, the couple in room 6 have been at it all night. I haven't gotten a wink of sleep. And she said, there is no couple in room 6. There's nobody in room 6. And there hasn't been. And we went into, and I said, well, something was in there because it kept me up all night. And when we went in, the beds are all really old, big postered, heavy wooden beds that are hard to move. And the bed was 6 inches away from the wall, which it had not been. So eventually Cheryl figured out that it was Uncle Frank moving the furniture. And she convinced him to stop moving the big stuff and just concentrate on things we could easily move back. And he was pretty agreeable to that. But for a long time, I didn't even realize. I mean, who thinks ghosts? If something is in a different place, I just assumed I'm not the only one in the house, so somebody else just moved it. But apparently, Frank is pretty active, and it was kind of funny, actually, to find out. But I moved out before she really started investigating. It's a shame she's not here, because she has great stories about Uncle Frank and his antics.
I think she was good.
Yeah, he's there. He's definitely there. And he makes himself known.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Heather, you want to get a lot more creepy now?
Sure. Yep. All right. So we'll dive right into it. And this is not really a ghost story, but is one of the creepiest true stories that I have ever read. And the what I'm reading from is an old Bow Times article from about 15 years ago that was written by Scott Fraser. And it's talking about the life and death of Pearlie Beck, who lived in Hopkinton. And so this is it's a lengthy article, but it's full of fascinating details. So I'll get started. On the morning of January 25th, 1890, Mr. Davis went to borrow a set of pulleys from his neighbor, Pearlie W. Beck, age 65. What awaited Davis was anything but the expected. What he found would confirm a decade of rumors that Beck, once a prominent member of the Hopkinton School Board, had committed 2 murders. The first unusual thing Davis noticed was the unlatched side door, an act of carelessness very unlike Beck. With no response to his calls, Davis went looking in the barn. In the barn lay dead from exposure and starvation several head of cattle, oxen, and sheep. They died within view of 100 bushels of corn. Inside the house, the sight was just as gruesome. Seeing blood on the floor just inside the side door, Davis entered the house. He found Beck's blood-covered body lying half on and half off a bed in the southeast corner room. Initially, it appeared Pearlie had been murdered. His body was covered in blood from a gash on his head. However, the events of the next few days would reveal that Pearlie suffered the same fate of his livestock, death from exposure and starvation. What officials discovered in the house confirmed their longtime suspicions that his sister-in-law's accidental death was likely no accident, and his brother, missing for 8 years, had likely met his end at Pearlie's hand. In the 1820s, Clement Beck and his wife, Susan Sargent, left life as Canterbury Shakers to raise a family in Hopkinton. They had 3 children, Pearlie, Calvin, and Abigail. By the time of their father's death in 1849, the farm was of considerable worth. The 3 children inherited the farm, but in 1852, Pearlie bought Abigail's interest in the property. Calvin had left for New York City to start a butcher shop business. When he fell upon bad times, he asked Pearlie for help. Taking advantage of his brother's financial difficulties, Pearlie bought Calvin's share of the farm for a measly $900. Now Pearlie had almost everything he wanted, except the love of a certain woman. His future now secured, he asked the conquered woman to be his wife, and she refused him. From that moment on, it was said by those who knew him that Pearlie became a miserable man. In the early 1870s, his sister died of cancer, and he hired a housekeeper, Mary Quimby. Over the next decade, Quimby would be credited with making the farm prosperous again. However, this prosperity would not last, and in 1880, their relationship ended. Some said she hoped to kindle a romantic flame with Pearlie. When it failed to evolve after 10 years of faithful service, she left and filed suit for $800 in back wages and loans. Fearing Quimby would win her suit, Pearlie called on Calvin for help. This was the first time in many years the two had communicated. Pearlie asked Calvin to move back to Hopkinton for a few years, and he agreed. Calvin brought with him a vivid memory of his brother's financial ill-treatment years earlier, and a new wife, Catherine Beck. The three took up residence at the farm. To protect his farm from Quimby's claim, Pearlie signed all his property over to Calvin and his wife as a temporary measure. A while later, Pearlie settled his differences with Quimby and asked Calvin to sign the property back to him. However, Calvin refused. Believing Pearlie had taken advantage of his earlier financial plight, Calvin found his opportunity to return the dubious favor. Calvin and Catherine agreed to let Pearlie live out the rest of his life on their farm, but three apparently became too much of a crowd for Pearlie. About midday, May 6, 1880, a neighbor and member of the Board of Selectmen was tending his field when he saw Pearlie rushing toward him. There had been a horrible accident at the house, and Calvin's wife was dead, Pearlie told the selectmen. Rushing to the Beck home, Catherine was found burnt to a crisp on the kitchen floor. According to Pearlie, he became thirsty while working in a potato patch and returned home for a drink. Entering the back door, he smelled something burned and found Catherine ablaze on the floor in front of the kitchen stove. He threw a bucket of water on her and hastened to report the matter to the selectman he knew lived nearby. The selectman authorized her immediate burial at nearby Stumpfield Cemetery in what was to become a much criticized decision. With his sister-in-law badly burned, people questioned why Pearlie sought a legal response rather than a medical one. The selectman was criticized for failing to notice the woman's surroundings. Presumably, she had burned to death when she opened the stove door and her dress caught fire. What he had neglected to notice was that the incident supposedly involved a stove in which there was no embers of fire. County Solicitor Herman Green was very suspicious of Pearlie's story. If her dress had truly caught fire, why did this strong, robust woman simply sit down on the floor and allow herself to be burned to death? Why had she not tried to flee? Why did she not try to rip off her dress? Why was she sitting bolt upright on the floor with her arm raised above her head in a defensive manner? How could all of this occur in front of a cold stove? Mr. Green believed Catherine was dead before the fire started. Although he wanted to pursue the matter, he felt Pearlie's favorable standing within the community presented too great a political obstacle, nor did he have any hard evidence pointing towards Pearlie's guilt. Calvin did not learn of his wife's death until he returned home. The sympathy and kindness Pearlie offered his grieving brother surprised many who knew him. People began to believe this tragic incident served to uncork a streak of gentle kindness that the old miser had kept hidden for so many years. Calvin accepted his brother's explanation of Catherine's tragic death. The two men lived alone in desolate solitude. It was not uncommon for the neighbors to hear loud arguments between the two at night. After a while, Calvin began to take an interest in a woman named Betsy. As the relationship evolved, Pearlie became enraged. The thought of another woman in the house was unacceptable. With Calvin and Catherine never having children, Calvin was the only barrier to Pearlie regaining complete ownership of the farm. In his 60th year, Calvin, a teacher by profession and farmer at other times, stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighing about 160 pounds. He had piercing black eyes, thin cheeks, a prominent nose, and a dark complexion. His hair was gray with a matching full beard about an inch long and had a clear voice that was rather high-pitched. He walked with his shoulders thrown well back, had a nervous jerk to the head, and carried his arms more than the usual distance from his body. On Friday, June 9, 1882, Calvin had dinner at Betsy's house across the street. He told her he would be leaving on the morning train to collect 3 notes owed to him. First, he would travel to Loudon, then on to New York City. I shall be back here, however, next week without fail. As he left Betsy's house, he promised to stop by in the morning before leaving, but never showed. He was never seen again, dead or alive. Sounds of trouble were said to have been heard coming from the house that night, but this was hardly unusual for the Beck brothers. Questions arose 2 weeks later when Calvin failed to return. Pearlie said his brother had left for good, taking all his valuables with him. He did not know where his brother had gone, and for that matter didn't really care. He suggested that Calvin had left the country for parts unknown. County Solicitor Herman Green, still suspicious of Catherine's death 2 years earlier, investigated further. Green learned Calvin never climbed aboard the train that morning and never reached any of his destinations. Most suspected Pearlie had murdered his brother, but few dared to share their thoughts publicly. Horace Choate was the only neighbor known to have asked Pearlie about Calvin's disappearance. Said Choate of the conversation, "He looked at me without making a reply, but never in my life have I seen such a devilish face upon a human being as that which confronted me." Finally, with a strange laugh, he said, "I don't care where he is, do you?" I would not have been tempted for money to have spoken to him again about the case. Both Pearlie and the farm began to deteriorate. He invested heavily and lost heavily in Western railroads. He lived the life of a recluse, seldom venturing outside his house, never allowing anyone inside. In search of the house, investigators Pearlie had good reasons for not wanting anyone to venture inside. Hidden away in a remote section of the attic was a locked valise containing Calvin's best suit, the suit he had most certainly would have worn while traveling. In another remote section of the house was Calvin's only other suit, heaped in a pile of rubbish. Opening a lockbox found hidden under Pearlie's bed, they discovered the 3 notes owed Calvin, notes he would have surely taken with him if he had truly left to collect those debts. Another handbag was found hidden in the ceiling of the attic. The key was found on a ring of keys hidden in Pearlie's bed. Inside the bag were Calvin's watch and chain that neighbors said he carried with him habitually. Also in the bag was Calvin's seal ring he always wore and his title to the farm conveyed to him by Pearlie, the subject of much discontent between the two. 2 blood-stained pillows without pillowcases were still lying on Calvin's bed. The bloodstains continued down the bed's dust ruffle and across the wooden floor. The pillowcases were found downstairs, one of which was stained and spattered with blood. A set of bloodied iron scale weights was found in the closet of Calvin's bedroom. In a nearby chest was material that at one time had been saturated with blood. Mr. Green was to conduct an extensive search for Calvin's body in the basement and trail of ramshackle buildings leading off the back of the house. Of particular interest was a pig pen in one of the dilapidated buildings. Neighbors noticed that immediately following Calvin's disappearance, Pearlie moved the pigs to another location. For a man who neglected his farm for many years, Pearlie worked diligently on the pig pen. He had gravel and stone piled up until the pen was completely filled in. Thereafter, Pearlie avoided the building like the plague. The records are silent on whether Mr. Green had the pig pen dug up. Surely a difficult task, given it was dead of winter. If he did, Calvin's body certainly was not located. When Pearlie's blood-drenched body was first discovered, it was supposed he had been murdered. The next day, he was laid out upon the kitchen table. The faces of curious onlookers peering through the windows diminished the light and made it difficult for the doctors to perform their work. With the body cleansed, the blood was determined to have come from a cut above Pearlie's left eye. A neighbor had seen Pearlie fall on the ice a few days earlier. Although it had bled profusely, the cut was not serious enough to kill him. The other marks and bruises all about the body were attributed to Pearlie's self-deteriorated condition. He had lived in squalid conditions of filth that enveloped the entire house. A hole remained burned through the kitchen floor in front of the stove, the ceiling above charred, both reminders of Catherine's fiery death a decade earlier. Upon examining his stomach, the doctors concluded Pearlie had starved himself to death. The stomach had shriveled to 1/3 its normal size and contained only 3 grains of undigested corn, swallowed whole while raw. The cause of death was ruled self-starvation, accompanied by a small pneumonia in the right lung and exposure. Pearlie was buried in the Stumpfield Cemetery, as had Catherine. With the construction of the flood control project in 1959, the cemetery was relocated to the backside of the Kentucky Cemetery. In a back row stands Pearlie's tombstone. Catherine's final resting place is unmarked and presumed to be one of the 128 identified graves. And there's a story from 130 years ago in Hopkinton.
Hopkinton serial killers. I recall there were other allusions to like people passing through and mysteriously disappearing.
Right. And no one wanted to bring it up because they feared that they might be next.
There was one in Warner quite recently. I think we all know about it.
Oh, I don't think I do.
It's too early to tell.
Okay.
I'm back in 100 years.
Come back in 100 years.
So, Sue Mitchell, I hear you have some nice spooky stories.
Oh, Sue is,
Can
hold
you
on,
unmute?
Sue.
There, is that better?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Okay. So Heather asked me if I would tell a little bit about the happenings at Kimball's Lakeside Tavern. That is now Lake House Tavern in Hopkinton Village, down by the fire station, right on the Kimball Pond there. And over the years, different owners who ran the taverns lived in the building. They lived upstairs. And so I have a few stories, and but I would like to preface it by what Heather had given me, a little history here. What today is Lake House Tavern at 157 Main Street in Hopkinton has had many incarnations in the restaurant business over the years, including Horseshoe Tavern and Blazers. It was built as part of a home in the 1850s and passed through family lines to Frank Mills. And I was kind of giggling, Heather, when you kept talking about Frank. I don't know, maybe we don't want to know any Franks. Frankly, I rather, no. There has been some speculation over the years that Mills took his own life in the mid-1920s because he was still despondent over his wife's death 2 years earlier. But a death certificate at the Historical Society shows that Mills died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound in 1931. So I think we're coming upon why there's a ghost there. His wife did not die until 1937. On his death certificate, he is listed as married, although the 1930 census has his wife living in Massachusetts. He may have been bereft at the state of his marriage, but certainly not because of her passing. Whatever the circumstances, there has been numerous reports of Frank Mills making his presence known at the building over the years. So we can go back to probably the early 1980s. This is sent to me by Marion Richards, who was a waitress there. The old tavern has been around for years. How many? I'm not sure. I found myself working in that old building when it was called Kimball's Lakeside in the early 1980s. Since then, it has changed hands several times, and it is currently known as Lake House Tavern, Main Street in Hopkinton. Big John Jones, he was the owner of the Kimball's Lakeside, hired Marion as a waitress back then. Coming from Concord, I'll read it in her presence as she wrote it. I was a stranger to the little town of Hopkinton and Kentucky Village. I chose to work there because I was tired of the harried atmosphere of the restaurant I worked on Concord Heights. I needed a change of scenery and people in my life. Big John at some point showed me an article about the ghost that supposedly resided in the restaurant. I never laughed at such things because I believe there is much more to our existence than we will ever learn in this lifetime. However, I soon forgot about the stories as I went about learning the routine of my new job and making acquaintances with the local customers, as well as the staff that also were local people. I worked every weekend and helped every Sunday with the popular buffet that John served. Holidays were always on my schedule, as well as they were the busiest days of all for us. One Thanksgiving, I was busy on the second floor. Now, I don't think the present restaurant uses that floor. Let's see. Okay, so there's the main floor, and this was upstairs on the second floor, and that's where the apartment is, where the owners would live from time to time. Thanksgiving, I was busy on the second floor setting up tables, workstations, etc. for the crowd that would be coming. As I worked in the back room, I heard noises from another dining area and assumed someone else had joined to help me set up. Silverware was clanking on the tables, and I heard footsteps in the room. There were about 3 rooms up there. I was surprised I had not heard the person coming up the squeaky wooden stairs, but just went about my business. When I passed the other room to go back downstairs, I noticed no one was in the room. Again, I was surprised I hadn't heard the person go back down the stairs. On the main floor, the other 2 waitresses were still busy setting up, and I casually said, by the way, thanks for helping me upstairs. Which one of you were up there? They both looked at me with a very puzzled expression and insisted that neither of them had been upstairs. I laughed, assuming they were playing a practical joke on me, but were they? Another incident occurred months later. I was running up and down from the kitchen area to the bar, so that's 2 sets of stairs, to retrieve goods from the walk-in freezer behind the bar. Each trip I made, I turned the interior freezer light on and shut it off when I closed the door. However, each time I returned downstairs, the light was on again. At first, I thought I was forgetting the light, so I became very careful to make sure the light was out before I shut the freezer door. Still, the light was on again each time I went back downstairs. I asked Big John if there was a problem with the light, and he went downstairs with me to check it. It was on again. He played with the switch several times and assured me it was fine and that I was just forgetting to shut it off. I knew I was shutting it off and was absolutely sure something haunting was happening. Do I still believe that? I sure do. So all the time I worked at the Lakeside, I often felt a presence with me as I entered an empty room or an empty bar or the dining room as I swept up after each of my shifts. The story was that a man had hung himself in the cellar of that building years ago, and he still haunted that dwelling. What do you think? And after, Heather, you gave me that information about Frank there, maybe, that's maybe where he killed himself. I don't know. So that's one story. Now, if you want to go to someone else and then you want to come back, I have another, series of happenings by John Jones's partner. and they lived upstairs. So, but you can come back to me if you want, or tell me not to come back, or I will be back.
Heather, do you want to take them to Mount Kearsarge for a bit?
Sure,
Okay.
that'd be nice.
So this story we found in Larry Sullivan's book about Mount Kearsarge. So it takes place between Sutton and Warner by the mountain, and it's the area's unsolved mystery. And in the book, he entitles it A Mysterious Affair. And I'm going to just read a short selections from it because Larry, of course, researched this very thoroughly and talked about all the newspapers articles. So you can get the book and read the detailed version if you'd like. But here's a short version. Mary Anthony West remembered riding by the murder place on the North Road in Sutton, along the foothills of old Mount Kearsarge. Back then, everybody knew the spot. The road was narrow and dark with a gnarly, dense canopy of overhanging trees and dead vines. It was a lonely place, a spooky place, a place where sunshine never touched the road. In the 1930s, her father often drove the family's Packard touring car to Warner this way, a shortcut from their summer home in New London, through North Sutton, past the Davis family's primeval forest, then toward Warner on the Old North Road. As the car got closer, somebody always whispered that they were near the murder place. And hearts beat faster, and eyes glanced out the isinglass windows in the old touring car's side curtains. After a few seconds of silence, beyond a slight turn in the road, the large 8-cylinder automobile burst out of the ghastly darkness into the welcoming sunlight. The unspeakable crime was quickly forgotten. Life was back to normal until the next time. Today, there are only a few people who know of this murder place, and there are differences of opinion about the exact location. But nobody seems to know who was murdered, or when, or why. It's a conundrum. Somehow the basic facts of the story have been lost. A handful of folks know that there was a murder near this place long ago, but that's as far as their story goes. So, Larry researched it. And the following are the facts of the mysterious affair that happened near the North Road on the side of Mount Kearsarge. In the last days of November 1840, farmer John Eaton and his men set out to find some lost sheep in his pastures. There was snow on the ground, and the men needed to locate the strays and herd them to their winter quarters at Eaton Farm. While searching in an almost inaccessible morass or swamp in a lonely and unfrequented ravine well up the side of Old Kearsarge, they made a gruesome discovery. In a ravine into which the eye of men might not penetrate for 1,000 years, they found the body of a horse, recently deceased. It had been led to this dismal place, tied to a tree, and executed. Its throat had been slit. It was a valuable horse, strong, well-groomed, and sleek. The word of this dastardly crime quickly spread throughout the region. Hundreds of people on foot, on horseback, and in carriages from near and afar soon visited the North Road and endured the difficult climb to the place on the mountainside where the poor beast was slain. They stood on the exact spot where the crime was committed, helped authorities to search for evidence, and sought to determine for themselves what really happened on that fateful day. Most visitors quickly determined that they were in the midst of a murder, not just the murder of a fine horse, but the murder of a man, the man who was riding this fine horse. Folks figured that the murdered man was riding his horse on the dreary North Road, a place that was peculiarly fitted for the commission of deeds of darkness, when he was ambushed, robbed, and killed by bandits. They believed that the body of the man was probably dumped or buried nearby on the mountainside, and that his horse was then led up the mountain and killed to destroy the remaining evidence. North Road was the perfect place for such an ambush. It was a very narrow route, heavily treed and dark. with many spots suitable for the ambush of an unsuspecting rider. Although the road was infrequently used, it was known to be a shortcut for Boston businessmen who were traveling by horseback to Vermont. These men usually carried large sums of cash. A published report in the New Hampshire Patriot that the body of a man had been found near the site caused some additional excitement, but it wasn't true. Extensive inquiries in the Northeast did not turn up any reports of missing horses with the characteristics of the slain steed. And although there were accounts of missing men during this period, none was noted as having such a fine mount. Locally, some folks eyed their neighbors with suspicion, and rumors persisted for decades. In fact, one rumor that a certain Warner merchant may have committed the crime against an out-of-town Jasper who did not pay his bill has persisted since the mysterious affair and is still known by a couple of local historians today. In a review of the facts of the case, a writer in an 1887 edition of the Kearsarge Independent newspaper noted, "It is probable that down deep in some ravine or in some den among the ledges lie the bleached bones of the dead man, there to remain undiscovered until the angels of the apocalypse shall summon him from his lonely rest, to confront his murderer from the great white throne of ultimate and avenging justice. If you believe that there was a murder committed, perhaps you should take a ride on the North Road from North Sutton toward Warner, past the East Sutton Road, and get a feel for the area. Visit that section of road, as hundreds of people did at the time, and look up into the side slopes of the old mountain and visualize the terrible incident. Decide for yourself. There's not a sign that tells you when you've arrived. You'll have to find the spot, although it might not be too difficult. Some folks have said that they could sense the location, or that they always get a creepy feeling when they pass by. Like young Mary Anthony and her family, people seemed to know when they were near the murder place." And I now want to go try that out. See if I can feel it for myself. Now I see that Dan Dustin has some stories to share.
One only. I've written it, so it will take exactly 6 minutes. I'm titling this story, "A Lesson in Fear." It is the true story of the scariest night of my life. It was the summer of 1969. I was 22 years old. I had just finished my first year teaching, and I needed a real break. I'd found a big river on the map and decided to paddle its entire length. I was camped in high grass, right at the water's edge, somewhere in eastern Canada. I was essentially lost. I only knew I was on the St. John River, 200 or 300 miles from its source in the Maine wilderness. I'd been paddling for 3 solid weeks without seeing a single other boat, or, with the exception of the border towns where half my gear was stolen, almost no other people. I was suffering from all the usual complaints: dehydration, sunburn, poor nutrition, poison ivy, blisters, insect bites, an axe wound that probably should have had stitches. I'd stepped on a nail. Exhaustion, serious exhaustion. I was losing weight at an alarming rate. Unfortunately, I didn't know it. My old cedar canvas canoe was beginning to leak, and oil canning worse and worse as more and more of the ribs were being broken against rocks each day. So there I was, only 200 or 300 miles more to go, camped in the high grass on the water's edge for a good reason. One, my air mattress had sprung a leak, so I needed the cushioning. And two, I had learned to keep my canoe tied to my tent so that I wouldn't have to wake up on another morning to find it floating out in the middle of the river. I'd fallen hard and fast asleep, as usual, to the lullaby of gentle breezes brushing the high grass against my tent, and sometime in the middle of the night was startled awake by the watery splashing sound of something big coming up out of the river right at my feet. I was frozen in fear as it moved up the bank, the displaced grass brushing against the canvas of my tent. Curiosity was not as strong in me as fear, and it was pitch dark, and I had no flashlight. Anyhow, it seemed safer to lie there breathless and hoping not to be stepped on or eaten alive. Can you turn the light on, that light there? Thank you. I couldn't imagine what it could be. The Abenaki have a river monster that comes to the riverbank and pulls you in. The Hurok have a sea monster that lurks, waiting to pull down the exhausted swimmer. But there was this horrible story that a mean counselor used to tell us when I was a kid in summer camp. It was about a giant carnivorous slug that crawled up out of the lake and oozed in under the door of the cabin. And he would point to that crack under the door of the cabin and make you look at it. It got worse from there. And I'm not going to tell you that story, but I'll tell you this. Finally, the camp director had to tell him to stop telling it. Well, that's the one that got me that night. But the thing passed me by, and somehow, it must have been my condition, I fell back to sleep. It happened again. Later, the gurgling in the water woke me with pounding heart, and the monstrous creature, whatever it was, moving up beside my tent. But this time, there was a little light dawning. The monster hesitated at my tent. My senses exploded with a charge of adrenaline. I could feel its eyes. I heard it sniff, smelling me. Curiosity won over fear, just barely. I bent my knees, planted my feet, and slowly pressed my upper body out through the tent flaps. And there she was, a young deer, eyeball to eyeball with me, and the prettiest thing you'd ever want to see. A drop or two of water still on her nose. And I just started to sing. Oh, you are so beautiful. And I have camped right beside your path to the river to drink. But your passing did not wake me, for I was used to the feel of long grass waving. But when you drank, that was a new sound, and it brought fear. You are so innocent, and I so full of bad thoughts. Thank you for your wisdom and beauty. We looked into each other's eyes for the longest time. It was a little like falling in love. Then she bent her knees, lowering her backside. Her forehooves left the ground. Her body turned away from the river and me, and she bounded away into the forest. I thought of her from time to time as I paddled downriver day after day. I don't suppose she ever thought of me.
That was great. Thank you, Dan.
Yes, it was.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for making me remember it.
So Heather, do you want to talk about some witches? We had witches, we promised witches.
Sure. Let's see. Well, what I had actually was a rather short story about an evil salamander that I can read quickly. And this is from a book, 1932, called New Hampshire Folk Tales. It's called The Salamander. 100 years ago, a bed in the kitchen was very common, and many a girl felt that when she was married, she would enjoy this luxury. A saying strongly believed at that time was that if the family kept the fire in the fireplace 25 years without allowing it to go out, a salamander would come and eat up the fire at the end of the quarter century. This true story came from a town not far from Concord, New Hampshire, where a couple had kept the spark aglow on their hearth for the appointed time. One day, the woman decided to have a boiled dinner and planned to have a bag pudding made with Indian meal boiled in the pot with the pork and vegetables. She had the pot over the fire, and the dinner was well underway, bag pudding and all, then stepped out of the kitchen for a few minutes. When she returned, she saw a strange object traveling across the kitchen floor and go under the bed. In the smoke and ashes rolling out of the fireplace, she saw the track of this object across the unpainted floor, saw the fire was out, and at once decided a salamander had come. She hastened to the door and said, "Jacob, the fire has burned 25 years and the salamander has come and eaten it up. The salamander is under the bed. Get your axe and kill it." Jacob took the axe and came in, wonder-eyed. The smoke and ashes were still in evidence. He examined the track from the fireplace until it disappeared under the bed. Cautiously, he looked under and saw the salamander. The brave man attacked the intruder with the long-handled shovel and brought the furred and feathered object from under the bed. He saw what looked like a strong string, used in tying a pudding bag trailing after the salamander. Upon closer examination, he found that the defenseless salamander was his wife's Indian pudding. It had rolled out of the pot when the hook on the crane broke, and in its transit across the unswept floor and under the bed, its greasy surface had gathered a coat of lint and feathers. The pot liquor had put out the fire, and the supposed advent of the unwelcome salamander was explained. But Lynn, now if you want to, do you want to tell about some local witches?
I will. I'll tell about some local witches. So I will tell some Hopkinton witch stories because the writer of the Warner town history, although he acknowledges that people were accused of witchcraft, he wouldn't spill any details because he didn't believe it and thought it was just a terrible thing that they had even pointed the finger. So obviously, we were settled in the 1700s, so the Salem witch trials had come and gone, but people still believed in witches, that Satan walked among them and they had to be very careful, and Satan's tool really were these witches a lot of the times. So on a dark night like this, you could imagine people hearing and seeing all kinds of strange things. So this I'm also taking from New Hampshire Folk Tales. There appears to have been two great witches in the town of Hopkinton. There were Witch Burbank, whose home was in Kentucky Village, and Witch Weber, who lived on the southern part of Beech Hill. Witch Weber seems to have been willing to be recognized as a person of occult gifts, and her exploits also appeared to have been more remarkable in reputed character. We judge so, since Witch Weber is traditionally claimed to have acknowledged a journey to Lynn, Massachusetts, where the famous Moll Pitcher resided, to attend a convention of weird sisters. Witch Weber's statement of a journey to Lynn was confirmed in the mind of one man at least, in a singular manner. In sailing through the air on the way to her destination, the witch averred that, in passing a barn on Diamond Hill, she stubbed her toe on the roof and detached a few shingles by the suddenness of the contact. The owner of the premises, hearing the report of the exploit, mounted a ladder and examined the roof of his barn, finding, in the palpable evidence of a few lost shingles, a fact to himself satisfactory and indubitable that the witch's words were true. So there we have it. And there was a similar story about loose shingles in Warner, so that must have been the thing that witches did. Flew too low, barnstorming maybe, and knocked some shingles off the barn. Sue, do you want to share another story?
Mute.
There you go. Oops, sorry, I muted you accidentally. Can you unmute again?
Unmute.
You're still muted.
There.
There we
There.
go.
Better?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So this is actually stories that John Jones, as I told you, was the owner, and he lived upstairs. So it's told by his very dear friend. Sometimes after all the customers had left the tavern and the owner had retired to his room upstairs, he would be awakened by the sound of pots crashing to the kitchen floor. He would race back down the stairs to the kitchen only to find all the pots hung on the hooks just as he had left them. Other times he awoke to the sound of water running in the second floor bathroom. But when he bumbled his way to the bathroom, turned on the light, and reached to turn off the faucet, he would find no water running and the sink to be dry. One night he was frozen in fright upon hearing the tavern door by the parking lot being smashed open, followed by footsteps running up the stairs all the way to the second floor where he was now hiding, and then down the hallway to the where the owner was hiding, and then down the hallway to the other end of the building. The owner waited in silence, listening intently, but hearing nothing further, he ever so cautiously went to find the intruder, but no one was there. He then crept down the stairs in order to check the tavern door. There it was, just as he had left it, shut tight, locked, and without so much as a scratch. Through the years, others living on the second floor have reported hearing the sound of many chairs and tables in the main dining room being moved around. When they went down to see what was going on, however, the tables and chairs were just the way they had been set at the end of the day, not moved even an inch. As if to confirm earlier tales, one winter's night in the middle of a very big snowstorm, the owners could hear banging on the tavern door downstairs, followed by the door crashing open, footsteps running up the stairs, stopping by the kitchen, then clumping up the stairs to the top floor and down the hallway to the far bedroom, and that door being slammed shut. When they looked out the window to see the parking lot, it wasn't plowed. There were no vehicle tracks to be seen. They went down to check the back door, but the floor was dry. The door was shut tight, and opening it revealed no footprints in the snow. Then they ran to check the front door, but found it also shut, locked, with no signs of entry, and the snow outside being completely undisturbed. Such unexplained happenings have been reported over many years by many different occupants. Could these experiences have been nightmares or images from personal twilight zones, or could Kimball's Lakeside Tavern really be haunted? If there is a soul or spirit there still trying to resolve its earthly issues before moving into the next realm, would you dare take residence there and try to confront the ghost? Now, I don't know if the present owner, he has heard all these stories and if there's any stories that have come from him. But just one last thing, my husband was a bartender there. And one night they had a, what do you call it? They had a seance. Okay, so this lady came and did this. And the four of them were sitting around a card table up on the second floor. And she started talking to the spirit or whatever. And the table literally rose up and banged against the wall and back down. Now, my husband doesn't tell stories. I mean, he really believed in ghosts when he was alive and such. And so I said, oh, come on. You probably had somebody's foot under there and it made the table rise. He said, no, it really did. So I guess there are, if you believe. So, and the St. Paul school kids used to come out a lot when their parents came to visit them. And they'd ask where the ghost was. And we said, well, it might show up, it might not. So thank you for letting me tell these. It's something to ponder for sure.
Thank you very much. And, you know, I've heard some other stories, snippets of other stories in Warner that David and Lorette Carroll's house has another friendly ghost. They think it's Mr. Dudley, whose nickname is Everyday Dudley. They say when somebody comes to visit them, he makes his presence known. He wants to see who's there. And I also heard of a story recently that I don't have many details on. Maybe some of you know about it, but there's a ghost in a house around Tom Pond where the owner saw somebody with like a tall stovepipe hat on, I think it was. So I know that you guys have some more stories. If somebody wants to share something.
May I interrupt a moment?
Yes.
It occurs to me as I experience this with you that the town of Hopkinton has in fact 3 libraries, one being the dump and another being the flea market. And at the flea market, I have collected 2 volumes of a set of books known as Zigzag Journeys, which were school books, 19th century school books. And one of them reports the following, and I'll make it as quick as possible, but it's very interesting, and I'd never heard of it before. When the woman of the house, in the old days, is weaving or braiding the candle wick, she gathers up a few very small feathers, the kind that go into pillows, chicken feathers, and cuts the ends off of the quills, tiny, tiny quills, until she gets 2 that fit together, open end to open end, like unto a capsule type pill. And she fills this with gunpowder, which she introduces into one very special wick, which she dips or molds into a candle, which is remembered and kept in a special place. And on Halloween night, that candle is placed in the middle of the table, being the only light in the room. And people sit around and tell ghost stories, and nobody knows when or if it will explode.
What do you think, Heather? Should we do that next year?
Sure.
This would be the old days when the floors were earth and the walls were wood and nobody cared. These would be tallow candles. So forget wallpaper and sheetrock.
So does anybody else have a story they'd like to tell? Well, that being the case, we have a story that Caleb Parsons, one of our brand new board members in Warner, is going to share with us. A creepy story.
Good evening. My name is Caleb, and yes, I'm a new member to the Warner Historical Society. Very happy to join and share this story with you. This is taken from, oh, it's backwards, but that's all right. The new annotated works of Hp Lovecraft. While New Hampshire is not featured in many of his stories, it's mostly Rhode Island and Massachusetts and some Connecticut. He is certainly still a wonderful New England writer. And this particular story, one of his shorter stories, I promise, was written in 1917 and was published in 1919. It is one of his earliest tales, and it is simply known as Dagon. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, wanting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of the unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awakened, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was, in reality, more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to be almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock, which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All at once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventional aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water on account of their enormous size were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a door. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint, grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing while the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then, suddenly, I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital. brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. But soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient success and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever, as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-o-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may be at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likeness on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. Oh God, that hand! The window! The window! Thank you.
A quick comment that just occurred to me hearing you read that is Lovecraft read Coleridge. Yea, slimy things did crawl with legs upon a slimy sea. There's the flavors there.
Oh, yes.
It's sort of like your story too, Dan.
Yes,
it was very similar.
I noticed that, and it occurs to me that one of the factors here is that when we experience something that we don't understand, there is no place to put it. And so we have a hard time remembering it. And this has to do with lots of the confusion in lots of UFO sightings is that phenomenon. I think that's kind of in our nature.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us and scaring us and sharing your stories. I think that next year you should go out and collect some stories. I have lots of stories that didn't take place in New Hampshire, haunted houses I lived in. So I got lots of stories we could share in the future, and hopefully we can do it all sitting in the same dimly lit room, scaring each other to death next year. How's that sound?
And with a special candle.
Yes.
Sue had to leave, so I'm going to.
So
say
Mitchell,
thank
take
you
that
for
off,
doing
please.
this. And I see Mr. Dustin has a life preserver on. What's up with that?
Yeah.
Thank you for noticing.
Okay. Thank you for doing this. It was great.
Well, thank you all for coming. It was a lot of fun. Thank you for sharing your stories and for listening.
And now we'll
to
go
ours.
and have bad dreams.
Oh no. Happy dreams.
Happy dreams. Bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
This was awesome.
Are we done?
We're done.
Done.